Thank you for joining. My name is Tiffany Pang, and I'm a junior consultant at Turner & Townsend. We're joined today by Kyla Campbell. She's a senior consultant from Turner & Townsend. This is a Retrofit Information Support and Expertise RISE event, which is fully funded by the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, delivered by Turner & Townsend. There will be a relatively short presentation followed by plenty of opportunities for question and discussion, and the event will be 1 hour long and we will finish on time. Please keep your microphones muted and cameras switched off during the presentation. The slide deck will be made available after and then follow-up email to everyone that attended today. There will be a clean recording of this and all the other masterclasses in the resources section of the RISE website. We will provide all our useful links in the chat. Please ask questions in the chat function as we go, or there will be an opportunity to ask questions directly after the presentation. And finally, there will be a quick poll and a word cloud at the end of the session. Please complete them to help us understand the level of knowledge in our topics. I will now hand over to Kyla to start today's presentation.
Excellent. Thank you, Tiff. Yeah, so welcome to today's masterclass, everyone. So as Tiff mentioned, my name is Kyla. I'm a senior consultant at Turner & Townsend. I have previously worked for a local planning authority, validating, assessing, negotiating, and ultimately making decisions on planning applications. And I obviously work within the retrofit sector now, so I have quite a good understanding of sort of both pieces of the puzzle and how they interconnect, and some things to be aware of. So just going to take us through the agenda. So today we're going to look at an introduction to planning, so what it is, why it's important, and then planning considerations, and then looking at navigating the need for planning permission, so understanding what actions you need to take to understand where properties need planning permission or not, and what can impact the need for planning permission. And then we're going to look at the planning application timeline, so really taking you through it so you understand that. So when you're delivering a project, these are the stages an application goes through to allow you to effectively plan for those stages. And then we've got tips and resources to finish us off. So starting with an introduction of planning. So planning regulates the development of land and buildings. So a local planning authority is a responsible body for planning policy and development control, and in the United Kingdom we have a discretionary planning system, which means that planning decisions are made on a case-by-case basis against policy, whereas we are the only country that has that full discretionary system. Across the world there's a lot more variation, with some countries having a regulatory system, which is essentially zoning. So if development fits within the zone, it can go ahead, or a lot of other countries too have a sort of a blend of the two. So thinking about what planning doesn't consider, so it doesn't consider building regulations. They sit outside as their own entity and process that you need to comply with. Utility consent, so gas, electric, water, telecoms, again, all sits outside of planning. Any personal circumstances, so when you're making a case perhaps for a development to receive planning permission, the officer will not take any personal circumstances into account. Any sort of construction program or legal property matters, they are considered to be private matters that should be dealt with outside of the planning system. So I'll move us on. So why do we have planning? So we can see on the screen here, we've got that ultimately the goal is to strike a balance between progress and preservation. So planning plays a critical role in identifying necessary development, safeguarding areas that need protection or enhancement, and then assessing proposed developments for their suitability, dependent on those local needs or needs for protection. So what planning does is it ensures that the right type of development occurs in the right places at the right times, to make sure that we're building and developing in accordance with our more strategic aims, and that's brought through by the planning policy. So how are planning decisions made? There's multiple aspects that form into sort of how planning decision might be made. So first we have government policy. So that's the National Planning Policy Framework, and yeah, that stretches across nationally, obviously, and that's drawn down on. So you have sort of your national policy at the top, and then there's a second layer which is local policy. So the local policy is obviously local to specific areas. So each borough council, district council, depending on who has a planning authority in each area, has their own set of policies that development must apply to. So that policy aligns to that broader government's policy that sets out more of the strategic piece for development. And then we have sort of the next layer down, council guidance, where councils may prepare design guides to show more sort of iteratively what the policy means and how it should be translated into development and what a development needs to look like. So again, getting into more of a detailed layer of policy there. And then we have statutory consultations. So these are consultations that must happen legally on certain types of applications. So for example, if you have an application to build homes and there's protected trees on the site, or the site was in a conservation area, a statutory consultation would be the tree officer, for example. And then we have special designations, so greenbelt and conservation areas. So this is where the government has said, this is a special area, we want to protect it for some reason, and then there's specific rules that come with that special designation which impact how a decision's made or whether a decision is needed to be made in terms of whether planning permission is required. But we'll get into that in a little bit more detail as we go through. So next we're going to look at planning considerations. So planning consideration, oh, sorry, apologies, got a bit of a twitchy mouse. So planning considerations are the different factors that a local planning authority will take into account when making a decision about an application. So the considerations guide the planning system to balance development with community and environmental needs. So there's a few that we can see on the screen here. So we've got land use, impact on amenity, environmental impact, traffic and transportation, sustainability, community benefits, and impact on the street scene. And you might see that these considerations are referenced to slightly differently depending on the local planning authority in question because they have their local policy. The two that we've highlighted which are likely to impact on a householder application, which is obviously if you're delivering a domestic retrofit project, the type of application that you would be applying for if you were to apply for planning permission. The two that are going to be important to consider are impact on the street scene and impact on amenity. So impact on amenity is thinking all about shading, privacy, so really protecting the amenity that people have within their homes. So for instance, if you were doing retrofit and you thought actually we need to move this window slightly, then it's thinking about, okay, is that going to have an impact on the neighbour's amenity? And if it would be negative, then it obviously would be cause for that consideration, would be cause for it not to be approved. The one that's probably the most important though is the impact on the street scene. So this encompasses the way that streets and areas look and feel, and when this is going to be most important is when you're looking at delivering retrofit in conservation areas where that character is seen as extremely important to the essence of the area and needing to be protected. So if we're looking at measures such as external wall insulation or potentially solar PV, the consideration there is going to be whether it's going to have a negative impact on the street scene, and if so, how great that impact is going to be, and that's the evaluation that will take place. So what does all of this mean for applicants in terms of those considerations? So it's really important to think about the considerations when preparing a planning application, and particularly what your local planning authority says about those particular considerations. And also, just on that point, you might be delivering projects that spread across multiple local planning authority areas. So, there's a real investigative piece there to become familiarised with those different pieces of policy. So when you are, looking to design your retrofit project, you should try and address these considerations in your project design. So thinking about whether the measures that you're looking to deliver are going to require planning permission, and if they are, how you can mitigate them the best so that they have as little impact as possible on the amenity of neighbours or impact on the street scene, to try and give the application as much chance for approval. And that piece is really aligning with your local planning authority and their policy to enhance the chance of the application being approved. So a really key action here is to engage with your local planning authority and the officers that work there, and try and work proactively with them to understand this piece and align to the policy, and make sure that they understand the work that you're trying to do and why it's so important. Obviously, the importance of work, it is a consideration itself because it's sustainability, but it may not necessarily outweigh those other considerations. It really depends on that, and that is the decision of the authority. So here we've just got some reasons that an application may be rejected. So looking at where it might restrict road access, negatively impact safety, overdevelopment, and then these are the important ones for household applications, so loss of privacy, loss of light, negative impact on trees, and negative impact on character or appearance. Apologies. So it's really important to note that planning is all about balance, and the local planning authority, when they make a decision, they make it based on balance and weighing things up. So, you can never really have all green, ticks across the board in planning. It's really about that balance finding. So navigating the need for planning permission. So now we've done a quick stop through sort of what is planning, why is it needed, and then planning considerations. Now we're going to look at how to understand whether properties need planning permission. So first, I want to introduce you to permitted development rights. I think many of you will probably be familiar with permitted development rights if you have ever built, an extension or potentially a dormer onto your home, or put solar PV on, for example. Those activities are typically covered by permitted development rights. So they are regulated under the Town and Country Planning Act, and permitted development rights essentially removes the need to submit an application for planning permission for certain types of development. So typical ones include, as I mentioned, extensions, loft conventions, outbuildings, conservatories, but this is obviously all subject to the permitted development right criteria. And that's what we're gonna talk through now. So this is actually a bit more of an informational side as to where to get information about different permitted development rights. So we've got the name of the document at the top there, and part 1 looks at dwelling house alterations. So looking at EWI installation rights, solar PV, and different measures related to the home. And then we've got part 14, which looks at renewable installations, and then part 2 looking at EV chargers. But part 1 and part 14 will be the most helpful parts of that that document for you to look through and understand. And as we've mentioned, permitted development rights are national, so it's one document that applies to all areas, which is useful and simple. However, now we get into some complexities when we're looking at what can restrict permitted development rights, because this is where really that sort of local piece that happens within the planning system starts to come through. So permitted development rights are restricted in conservation areas. So firstly, a conservation area, if anyone's not aware, is an area of special architectural or historic interest, the character of which is considered worthy of preservation or enhancement. So the General Development Permitted Order details the requirements of restrictions for permitted development rights in conservation areas. So I think just off the top of my head, remembering from a few years ago, for example, solar PV, to certain measurements and development requirements, is permitted development for most homes nationally. However, in a conservation area, they can't be on the front elevation of a home or seen to impact the street scene. So that's the kind of thing where conservation areas impact permitted development rights. However, there are some instances where measures or developments, should we say, require that would be permitted development rights require planning permission due to them being in a conservation area. Next, we have area of outstanding natural beauty. So this is land protected by the Countryside and Rights of Way Act of 2000, also known as the Crow Act. So it protects the land to conserve and enhance its natural beauty. So very similar to a conservation area, but there's a focus here on natural beauty opposed to sort of architectural or historic interest. This is similar restrictions to a conservation area, the same in the GDPR. It will list out what the impact's like for AONBs, and it may be that planning permission is required for a measure that would typically be permitted development. And then finally, we have Article 4 directions, and that is a local tool. So planning permission, before I get into it, Article 4 directions are policies that remove one or more permitted development rights from a site or an area. So a local planning authority may say, this has happened in Nottingham, for instance, we have too many student homes and too high of a student population in some areas of the city, and it has negative impacts on some of the other residents who live there. So what they do is they set out a specific area where, to develop a family home into a home of multiple occupancy, planning permission is required when it wouldn't typically be required. So it's really just removing that right for specific measures. The Article 4, is common in conservation areas and AONBs. So you have conservation areas which are determined by the local planning authority in their area / region, and then the areas of outstanding natural beauties which are determined nationally. But the GDPO says what the impact of a conservation area is on those permitted development rights. Now, Article 4 directions are the way for the local planning authority to kind of have more control over that. So they may say, actually, we don't want solar panels on any conservation area roofs, whether it be the front or the back, drawing on my earlier example. So actually they would remove that in the Article 4 direction so that any solar PV would need a full planning application. Hopefully that makes sense. So it's really an opportunity for the council to have greater control over development. So it's really important to understand where those Article 4 directions exist and how they impact permitted development right and the need for planning permission. And then we have two more, which is listed buildings. So listed buildings are buildings or objects or structures that have been judged to be of national importance in terms of their architectural or historic interest. As the term implies, listed buildings are added to a national list, which is compiled by the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sports. And we have obviously varying levels of listed buildings. So, you have a grade 1 or grade 2 listed building, depending on sort of how important they are to the nation. So listed buildings and their curtilage. So by curtilage, we mean the area around the listed building, so the sort of site. They do not have any permitted development rights. So for any internal works to a listed building, something called listed building consent is required, and that is separate to planning permission, not separate, it's part of the planning system, but it's not planning permission. It's listed building consent. And then for external works to a listed building, any at all, planning permission is required. So if you're looking at delivering retrofit measures to property that's listed, and say you're looking at doing external wall insulation and perhaps, I don't know, roof insulation, you would need both full planning permission for a householder application, and also listed building consent. And then finally, we have previous planning conditions. So this is a really important one that I'd like to stress, just because it can go under the radar sometimes. So typically any home, or let's say if I take my home, for example, that is, able to use permitted development rights because, say, I don't live in a conservation area of outstanding natural beauty, and there's no Article 4 direction on my home, and it's not a listed building. So check, 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 check. However, when previous planning permission has been granted to a home, so say a few years ago I got a 2-story rear extension, what the planning authority could have done on that permission is, under the conditions section, removed my permitted development rights going forward. So this, sometimes the planning authority does this when a home's had a lot of development on it, and when looking at it in the face of it, actually, if that home then acted on their permitted development rights, then it might become sort of too much development for what seemed appropriate for, say, the area. So it's really important to be aware of that. And there's not necessarily a public library where you can go and find that. It really is about understanding from your local planning authority if any of the homes that you're looking at have had their permitted development rights previously removed through prior planning permission. So yeah, just want to be aware of a little bit of a red herring, if you will. So next we're going to look at Article 4 directions in a little bit more detail. So as we've said, it's a local tool, and it helps the local planning authority to restrict that permitted development right even further. I must say as well, it doesn't necessarily have to be in conjunction with a conservation area. An Article 4 direction can sit completely on its own and cast over an area that has no other sort of regulations on it whatsoever. And then we just have a few different types of Article 4 directions, so some that affect conservation areas, listed buildings only, or other land. And so the impact of an Article 4 direction is that a planning application may be required for development that would have otherwise been permitted development. And it's just about inquiring early, making sure that you understand where the Article 4 directions sit, and how they will impact the delivery of your retrofit works. So next we have a lawful development certificate. So similar to listed building consent, this is a type of certificate and documentation, should we say, that a local planning authority provides you. So a lawful development certificate is all about confirming the lawfulness of a development. And when I say lawfulness, meaning that it comes under permitted development rights, and that's completely lawful. So just going to go back a few slides. So when we're looking at this restriction here, which is previous planning considerations, the way that it really depends on the local planning authority. Some will be able to find this information out for you via an inquiry, but sometimes inquiries can take quite a while. It depends. So some local authorities will charge for inquiries, others not. There's pros and cons there. If it's not charged for, then it's not going to be a priority of the authority to sort of deal with. Or another way that you can find this out is through a lawful development certificate if the inquiry route is not the route you want to go down. And there are benefits to having a lawful development certificate anyway, because it provides legal clarity and assurance to local authorities and future buyers, which can be a really important piece, that your project complies with the regulations at that point in time. So there are two types of lawful development certificates. So for existing use or development, so perhaps you move into a home and you notice that there's an extension to the rear of it, and you're not sure if it's lawful, you could get a lawful development certificate done to confirm that, or a proposed use or development, which would probably be the most common method in this instance. Or you may have properties that you've done previously that you think actually it'd be really good to get that peace of mind that they're lawful. So it costs £129, and if the development is found not to be lawful, then it can be automatically transferred to a planning application, and that is half the cost of a planning application, which we'll get into. But you wouldn't essentially lose any money if the development wasn't lawful. It would just sort of flow through, which is really positive. So now we're going to look at the timeline of a planning application and sort of everything you need to consider as you go through the planning process. And so you may find that, if you don't need planning permission, so the pre-application advice, that's the first step. And if you don't need planning permission, or you're comfortable that the development meets permitted development rights, and you don't need a lawful development certificate, your journey can really stop there at that pre-application advice point, after you've engaged with your council and you feel confident in that you've looked at all those policies and all of those potential regulations, and that the home is actually, the works are lawful. However, you might find that you need to flow all the way through this this sort of timeline. And just to note, if you do need to do that, householder applications have a statutory decision period of 8 weeks. There's obviously a lot of strain on the planning system at the moment, which means decisions do often take longer than 8 weeks. So it's really worth sort of understanding how long it's likely to take from your local authority and planning in some comfort additional time there, so that ideally planning doesn't impact with the delivery timescales of your whole project. And then the cost of the full planning application for a householder application is £258. So first stage, we have pre-application advice. So this is where you're seeking advice from the local planning authority. This can be based on whether you need planning permission, or advice about the planning permission you're looking to prepare and its likeliness to be approved, and how amenable the authority are to it. So the local planning authority will provide guidance based on local and national policy, and as I said, important to see if permitted development rights apply to the homes you're looking at. And then next we have understanding the local and national validation requirements. So I've put that in bold because that is a really important piece to consider. So when an application is submitted, which might be jumping ahead slightly here, but it flows through, it's the application needs to meet a certain amount of sort of requirements to be considered valid. So only once it's valid does the application go into the 8-week lifetime. So let's say you submitted a planning application to me, for instance, and there were validation issues with it, so you hadn't provided the correct plans, shall we say. I am not legally obliged as a planning officer to communicate the lack of requirement being met, so validation can't be met, with you as the applicant in any sort of timescale, because you've sent something across that's not valid, and they're the rules. So most authorities wouldn't just leave something sitting for a really long time. They'll communicate with you what the application needs to become valid, because at the end of the day, that's an income stream for the authority. But it's really, really important to be aware of that. And if you submit an application, say that's missing plans, and then it takes the officer a week to get back to you, and then it takes you another 2 weeks to get those plans prepared, and then you resubmit them, you have met potentially, and then they've got to validate it, which is another week. You've potentially lost a month there of your planning delivery time frame, and no plans have been looked at all, and that's half of the 8-week period that you may have budgeted initially. So it's just worth being aware of that. So when you go to prepare the planning application, taking it that planning application is required, you will need to prepare detailed plans and documents, so completing the application form aligned to those validation requirements. So this could include architectural drawings, a design and access statement, elevations, and other necessary reports. So there's some useful resources at the end which will tell you how you can find out what those what those validation requirements are. But there are national validation requirements, and then there are local. So if you have different applications in two different areas or two different counties, you will, or probably lower down than counties, but yeah, districts, you will need to comply with both of them. So whilst the national will be the same across the board, the local will vary in terms of what the local planning authority wants to see, and some local planning authorities are stricter than others on those validation requirements. And also within here that you'll need to submit with the planning application is of course the fee for the application itself. So when you submit the application, the local planning authority will check it's valid, meaning that it includes the necessary information and documents. If it's not valid, it will not be processed until all missing information is provided. And you can submit your application via the planning portal, which is an online website. It's very useful, has lots of information, and you can pay online through the planning portal, or you can submit it in paper form directly to your council and pay the application fee through the local authority. Once the application has been received and it's validated, it will then be publicised and go to consultation phase. So this really gives the statutory consultees the opportunity to weigh in on the application, and that was one of those streams as to how those decisions are made. And other interested parties, so perhaps local residents. So you may have seen those planning posters on lampposts in your local area. So they tend to go up on the streets when an application impacts the street scene. So if you're looking at doing EWI in a conservation area, for example, they will definitely go up in those conservation areas to make residents aware, and then residents are able to put their views in on the planning application to form part of that consideration. And yeah, so the planning authority considers the comments, but they aren't necessarily Bible, should we say? So, you may have 4 residents complain for the same reason, but it's really up to the planning authority to weigh up what are those complaints based on. Do they align with planning considerations, or are they aligned to personal interests, that kind of thing, and weigh up the input of whether they should have an impact on the decision, and if so, what that impact should look like. Next, often a planning officer will do a site visit to assess the potential impact on the site. So considering those planning considerations we spoke through earlier, they often will need to arrange sort of access to the back garden if the back area is going to be impacted. I mean, probably with most retrofit applications it won't be necessary, because probably the most important consideration is going to be the impact on the street scene, but it does depend on the street layout. Say if you can see the rear of the property from other parts of the local area and it's still thought to impact that character, then there may be requirement for sort of back garden access. But even so, that consideration will be weighed up based on the impact on the local area. So really that should be accessible from local areas only, but just a warning that maybe that sort of home visit may be required into the rear area of the property. But typically, the site visit's quite a quick process. Planning officer comes along, takes different photos, assesses the impact, and then uses that to make the assessment of the application. So based on the consultation, policy, and the site visit, they'll make an assessment and decide whether they think that the development is suitable. And then once they've sort of made that decision in their mind, they can sometimes enter what I call personally a negotiation phase. So the planning officer may think that the application wouldn't receive permission, or they may not think it's suitable for permission. So what they can do is contact you to suggest that some changes are made to the design and the way that the potential measures are laid out in the home, or sort of the development itself. If they do that, it's really important to be proactive in those situations and open to suggestions, because they're not required to enter that negotiation phase. And obviously because retrofit is really sustainable and it, really important for the people living in the homes, I would like to think that most planning officers would be keen to enter that negotiation phase if there's a negotiation that can be made. But if there's not that proactivity, they could just refuse the application if they think it's refusable. Equally, on the other side, they could enter the negotiation phase thinking that it was probably acceptable, but trying to still make it as reduce the impact on the local area as much as possible. So that's also something to bear in mind. And then next we have decision. So decision will either be made by the planning committee or the officer. So it really depends on the size and the impact of the development. So delegated powers is where an officer makes a decision and then it's signed off by the head of planning at the local planning authority, or it may go to the planning committee, which is a committee made up of elected councillors to sit on that committee who vote on the decision. There's pros and cons to both. If you're looking at housing conservation areas, it's likely to go to the planning committee for a decision. Also, other times that it can go to the planning committee is if a resident complains to, say, their local councillor, local councillors have the power to sort of not expedite, but pull decisions through to be made at the planning committee. Planning committees tend to run on a monthly basis. So if say your decision was due on sort of the 8th week of submission, but on the 7th week a local councillor pulled it through to the planning committee and the next committee wasn't for another 3 weeks, you just have to bear that in mind in terms of how that could impact timescales and things. And then we also have extension of time requests. So that's something to be aware of. So sometimes if the officer who's dealing with the application thinks that the decision isn't going to be made in that 8-week period, they'll contact you for an extension of time request. And this is really the officer saying, I'm not going to get it done by the 15th of December, but it's realistic for it to be complete, for a decision to be made on this by the 12th of January, for example. My advice is to, again, be proactive with these extension of time requests by saying no. If the officer doesn't have the capacity to deal with the application, it's not going to impact their ability to make that decision any quicker. If applications time out and go over their lifetime of 8 weeks in this instance, then it will almost just go into an ether a bit of applications where the decision hasn't been made in time, which is sort of the council will keep track of decisions they make in time and out of time, and they obviously want to make as many in time as possible, but as soon as it goes out, it's out and it's in the ether. So if that, it's always best, in my view, to accept that extension of time request or work with the planning officer to understand why 4 weeks of an extension isn't going to be suitable and the impacts that it could have on your program, and why that's so important to consider, and perhaps more important than, say, somebody who wants a home extension. And then finally we have the appeal stage. So if your application is refused, the applicant has a right to appeal the decision within 12 weeks of the decision being made. We don't have third-party appeals in this country, so it is only the applicant who can make that appeal, and there will be an inspector assigned to the case who will review the decision made, why it was made, and all the details within the application, and then come to sort of a new decision. So they'll either uphold the planning committee decision or uphold sort of the appeal. One thing that is definitely worth mentioning here is that you do not need to own land to submit a planning application on it. So you probably noticed throughout this masterclass we've spoken to you all as though you were the one submitting the application, and that's because you don't need to own a piece of land to make that application. So it's probably the path of least resistance, definitely, is for those of you who are looking at delivering retrofit schemes, making those applications through your organisation. Obviously, once you've got that resident buy-in, because you don't want to go through a whole planning process without that. But if you get the resident to make that application, it obviously becomes really confusing and you can't manage it internally. And if you want to appeal, then you have that ability to appeal as an organisation who submitted the application. So that brings us to the end of the walkthrough. I'm really conscious of time. So we've got top tips, regulation, just kind of bringing home the points that I mentioned earlier, Article 4 directions, make sure you understand them, where they are and what they restrict, permitted development rights, really understanding if the homes you're looking at delivering measures to have all those permitted development rights, remembering that red herring that I pointed out at the beginning, and then conservation areas, understanding where your conservation areas are, how the permitted development rights are restricted by conservation areas, and if any Article 4 directions restrict them further. And then top tips for preparing a planning application: you want to start early. Data, knowing your properties. So that goes back to this piece, knowing which properties are going to require planning permission. You can work with a planning consultant. Your local planning authority won't be able to tell you which ones are good and which ones you should and shouldn't work with. There are a lot of local sort of one-person bands who solely work on sort of helping, local people get planning permission, which might be more cost effective than a large consultancy, but it's really, up to you to go and do your research and think about that, but it does come with a cost. Again, reiterating the importance of that validation piece so it doesn't impact your timescales. Account for the planning committee cycle. That information will be available through the local planning authority. Considering cost and time, really when you're designing measures, thinking about the visual impact on the surrounding area if that's required, and remembering that any breach of planning control, so if you deliver a development that isn't lawful, could be subject to enforcement. And then finally, we have resources. So we've got the planning portal website. So they have a common projects page where they go through different common projects and look at whether, planning permission is likely or not likely to be required. And if planning permission is required, what to do there. It sort of breaks down the GDPR a little bit more and it's a bit more engaging. And in that same breath, we have a very similar resource, which is the permitted development rights for householders, technical guidance. Again, this is much easier to read and navigate than the formal GDPO, but you will need to refer back to the GDPO. And then national validation requirements, they are here, and obviously remembering to check your local validation requirements too. And then finally, your local planning authority website for all of the policy guidance and any information that you can get. And also, actually, a top tip that's not on here in terms of engaging with your local planning authority. I have heard of retrofit projects previously where worked with the local planning authority and almost had one officer assigned to deal with all of their applications. So having sort of that agreement and relationship where the authority understands the importance of the applications, and this one officer in particular understands retrofit and why it's happening, and also what the measures are and why maybe certain changes can't be made based on measures, so giving them that technical understanding so that then it makes the process a lot smoother for the applicant. And then finally, just a plug to the RISE self-assessment. So if you're looking to develop a RISE retrofit project and you would like some help developing that strategy and program, then please do head over to our website, complete a self-assessment form, and once you complete it, we'll set a call with you, a follow-up call, and you will be allocated a one-to-one support manager who will help you really develop that strategy and be prepared to deliver retrofit. And yes, that's everything from me today. Sorry, I've run over a little bit there. There was a lot to get through, but my email's on the screen. We also have our RISE email and our RISE website, so please do get in touch if you would like to. I'm going to stop sharing now.